You think of WWII as a clash of giants: Germany, Russia, America, Britain. But what if I told you that one nation, Japan, quietly shaped the course of the war in ways you've never seen before? Japan wasn't just a minor player. It was a force of nature, a storm in the Pacific that caught the world off guard. Their ambitions, their tactics, their sheer unpredictability made them a unique and terrifying adversary. But this wasn't just about power. Japan had a vision of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a dream of a regional order where they would lead, not follow. And for a time, it seemed within reach. Yet, for all their ambition and strength, Japan's path was ultimately one of hubris and misjudgment. And what happened next would change the world forever. When we talk about Japan ruling the world in WWII, we're not just talking about military conquest. We're looking at a nation that, for a time, held control over vast stretches of Asia and the Pacific. This wasn't just about land, it was about influence, resources, and strategic dominance. Japan's empire stretched from the Siberian border all the way to the southern islands of the Pacific. But what exactly does it mean to rule in this context? It means having the ability to control economies, enforce laws, and shape the lives of millions in occupied territories. It also means having the military power to project force across oceans, to dominate trade routes, and to challenge the dominance of global superpowers. So, when we ask why Japan ruled in WWII, we're asking about the combination of military might, political ambition, and economic strategy that allowed it to rise as a global power for a brief but transformative period. This section is about setting the stage for understanding the full scope of Japan's wartime rule, what it meant, how it was achieved, and why it remains a critical chapter in global history. You might think this is just history, but the lessons of Japan's wartime decisions still echo in today's world. The way they balanced ambition with restraint and how they navigated global power shifts offers a mirror to modern geopolitics. Understanding Japan's choices during the war helps us see how nations rise and fall not just through force, but through strategy, culture, and the weight of legacy. It's not just about battles or bombs. It's about how a nation's identity, values, and vision can shape its path in the world even when that path is filled with conflict. By studying Japan's role in WWII, we're not just looking back, we're learning how to think about the future with more clarity and less fear. History isn't just about what happened, it's about what we carry forward. And sometimes, the past is the only way to understand where we are now. So, maybe you don't think you care about WWII, but if you care about the world we live in today, then you should secretly care about why Japan ruled the war. The Meiji Restoration began in 1868, a moment that reshaped Japan's destiny. A young emperor, Matsuhito, took the throne, and a group of reformers called the Meiji clique pushed for modernization, turning Japan into a military and industrial powerhouse. Japan embraced Western technology and military strategy, while preserving its own cultural identity. This duality gave them a unique strength, combining discipline with innovation, which would later shape their global ambitions. By the early 1900s, Japan had defeated China and Russia, proving itself as a rising power. The Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905 marked a turning point as Japan became the first Asian nation to defeat a European power in modern history. The 1930s saw Japan expand its empire across Asia, driven by a mix of nationalism, economic pressure, and ideological ambition. This period of rapid expansion set the stage for the Pacific War as Japan sought to secure resources and influence. Japan's entry into WWII was not just a military decision, but a calculated move to secure its future. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 was the culmination of years of strategic planning and national ambition. Japan's rise in the 20th century was a mix of brilliance and blindness. A nation that modernized rapidly and expanded aggressively, but at the cost of its own future. Its legacy is a complex one, still shaping the world today. Imagine a big, strong country with lots of ships and planes, but it's not the biggest. It's Japan, and it wants to be respected like the big powers. Japan is surrounded by water, so it needs to grow bigger to have more space. It decides to take over nearby lands to feel stronger and more important. Japan builds lots of ships and planes and starts taking over places. It believes it's the best, and that makes others scared and angry. But Japan is far from home, and the bigger powers don't like it. They fight back, and Japan can't win because it's too far and not strong enough. Japan's dream of being the biggest and strongest doesn't work. It shows that when you try to be bigger than you are, you can get hurt. Before the war, Japan was a nation in transformation. A blend of ancient traditions and modern ambitions shaped its identity, and its leaders saw expansion as a way to secure their place in the world. The Meiji Restoration had remade Japan into a global power, but the country still felt surrounded by rivals and uncertain about its future. It looked outward, seeking influence and resources. Japan's leaders believed in the concept of continental policy, aiming to dominate the Asian continent and secure vital resources. This vision was both strategic and ideological. The Empire of Japan saw itself as a rising power, destined to lead Asia. Its military was well-trained, its industry growing, and its leaders were determined to act before rivals caught up. With its navy and army ready, Japan's leaders made a calculated decision to strike first, believing that a bold move would secure their place in the world order. The Japanese military machine was built on a foundation of rigid hierarchy and centralized control. Every officer, soldier, and civilian was trained to obey without question, ensuring total alignment with the emperor's will. This structure was supported by a powerful navy and air force, both designed to dominate the Pacific and secure strategic islands. Japan's focus on naval warfare was a key part of its strategy to expand its empire. Japan's economy was heavily invested in war production, with factories working around the clock to supply its forces. This industrial capacity allowed for rapid deployment of troops and weapons across the Pacific. The government used propaganda to maintain public support, glorifying the emperor and portraying the war as a righteous mission. This helped sustain morale and justify the massive sacrifices being made. This system of control, production, and ideology created a war machine that was efficient, disciplined, and deeply committed to its goals, even as it underestimated the scale of the resistance it would face. The real trick wasn't just the planes or the ships, it was the way Japan bent the rules of war itself. They didn't just attack, they redefined what an attack could be. Japan's strategy was built on speed, surprise, and the idea that traditional naval battles were outdated. They didn't fight the way the West expected. They built their empire not on overwhelming force alone, but on the belief that the world's old rules of warfare were no longer fit for the future. This wasn't just military genius, it was a complete reimagining of how nations could wield power and how the world could be shaped by it. The Japanese military was driven by a deep, almost scientific faith in the power of technology and the precision of human calculation. Their strategies were not just about speed and force, but about the meticulous application of engineering principles. They saw war as a system of variables where each move could be optimized for maximum impact. This mindset gave them an edge in the Pacific, where their naval doctrine was built on mathematical models and calculated risk. Japan's engineers and strategists were trained to think in terms of efficiency and outcome like a machine, not a man. This approach led to innovations in carrier warfare and submarine tactics, which were often ahead of their time. But this scientific approach was not just about weapons, it was about control. Every action, every decision was part of a larger, calculated system. It was a mindset that allowed them to dominate the seas for so long. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Apple AirPods 2nd generation. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. The science of war in Japan wasn't just about destruction, it was about precision, control, and the belief that every battle could be predicted, optimized, and won through calculation alone. Imagine a ship that believes it can outrun the ocean. It's not about speed, but about being lost in a vast, uncharted sea with no map and no idea of where you're going. Japan, like that ship, was navigating a world it barely understood. It thought it could sail past the known maps of the world and still reach its destination, but the sea was vast, and the waters were filled with other ships. The mistake wasn't just in the destination, but in the assumption that the rules of the sea would bend to fit the ship's will. Japan believed it could control the storm, not realize it was caught in one. This analogy isn't about intelligence, but about arrogance. Japan's strategy wasn't flawed in its logic, it was flawed in its belief that it could ignore the reality of the world around it. In the end, the ship didn't sink because of the sea, it sank because it refused to listen to the tide. Japan didn't lose because of its enemies, but because it believed it could sail without a map. There's a story about a single Japanese soldier who, after the war, refused to surrender and was found decades later, still waiting for orders. It's not a myth, it's a real account of a man who clung to his duty, even when the world had moved on. His name is unknown, but his story is a testament to the depth of Japan's wartime ideology. This is the part that sounds made up, but isn't. It's the kind of story that gets passed down in whispers, but it's rooted in real events that shaped the lives of thousands. These stories aren't just about war, they're about belief, about the weight of duty, and about the cost of holding on to a vision that no longer fits the world. They remind us that the past isn't always what it seems, and that some truths are buried not in history books, but in the silence of those who lived it. The first myth is that Japan was a reckless aggressor. charging into a war it couldn't win. But history shows otherwise. Japan entered the war with a clear strategy, not blind ambition. Japan's leaders were not just warriors, they were planners. They believed in the power of their navy and the strength of their empire, and they prepared for a long and calculated fight. This was not an impulsive invasion, it was a calculated move. Japan was ready to fight, but not without understanding the risks. They believed they could control the war's outcome through diplomacy and strength. Japan's military was highly organized and trained, and its leaders were deeply invested in the idea of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They were not just fighting for territory, they were fighting for ideology. The second myth is that Japan was a reckless aggressor, blindly charging into war without a plan. But history shows otherwise. Japan had a calculated, strategic vision for expansion. Japan's leaders were not just reacting to events, they were acting with purpose. The idea of coercive diplomacy was central to their strategy, not just military might. They believed in the concept of national rejuvenation, restoring Japan's global standing through control of key resources and strategic territories. This wasn't just about conquest, it was about securing Japan's future in a rapidly changing world. The empire was seen as a necessary step toward peace and stability. To call Japan's actions reckless is to ignore the depth of their planning and the logic behind their choices. They weren't just fighting, they were building an empire for the future. Even today, the legacy of Japan's wartime ambition lingers in the quiet corners of our modern world. It's not always loud or violent, but it's there, woven into the fabric of how we live and learn. In the way we teach history, in the way we remember the past, Japan's wartime story is not erased, it's reinterpreted. Sometimes, it's framed as cautionary, sometimes as a lesson in resilience. There are also echoes in the way we think about national identity, about what it means to be powerful, to be responsible, to be remembered not just for what you do, but for what you leave behind. In our everyday lives, Japan's wartime past is not a battle to be fought. It's a shadow that walks beside us, a memory that shapes the way we look at history, at power, and at the choices we make. And so, the question remains, where is this hiding? Not in war, but in the quiet, in the everyday, in the stories we tell and the histories we choose to remember. In 1942, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan faced its greatest naval defeat. The U.S. Navy had anticipated their move and was ready with superior numbers and intelligence. Japan's carriers, once the pride of their fleet, were now outmatched. The American carriers launched wave after wave of attacks, striking with precision and overwhelming force. The Japanese Navy, confident in its own strength, failed to adapt. They underestimated the American will to fight and the technological superiority that lay ahead. Despite their tactical brilliance, Japan's strategic miscalculations led to a disaster that would shape the rest of the war. They had fought a battle they had no chance to win. This battle showed the gap between Japanese ambition and American capability. It was a turning point, not just in the Pacific, but in the entire course of the war. The Japanese Navy, with its carriers and aircraft, achieved what no other navy had before, the complete annihilation of an entire enemy fleet in a single battle. At Midway, they struck with precision, using intelligence and strategy to outmaneuver the Americans and sink 4 carriers in one day. Their air warfare tactics, like the kamikaze attacks, shocked the world, blending suicide and strategy in a way that defied conventional warfare. These actions, though brutal, were a reflection of Japan's deep-seated belief in the power of the collective and the divine destiny of the empire. In the end, their record-breaking feats were not just military achievements, but a testament to an entire nation's drive to reach the limits of human and technological possibility. By 1944, the Pacific was turning against Japan. American forces had pushed beyond the Philippines, and the Japanese Navy was no longer the dominant force it once was. The Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns had cost Japan dearly. Its cities were in ruins, its people were exhausted, and its military was stretched thin across the globe. The Japanese government, desperate to maintain morale, began to rely on increasingly desperate propaganda. The war was no longer about victory, it was about survival. As American forces closed in, Japan's leaders made a fateful decision. They would fight to the last man, even if it meant total destruction. The final days of the war were not just a battle of arms, but of will. The end came not with a surrender, but with an order to resist. Japan's leaders had no choice but to accept defeat, but the cost of that decision would be felt for years to come. The victory in the Pacific was not a triumph for all. For the people of Japan, it was a price paid in silence, a burden carried without fanfare. The war left scars that were not written in history books. It took the lives of millions, and for many, it erased the future they had imagined. The world saw Japan's military might, but few saw the human cost. The silent suffering, the unspoken grief, the loss of innocence. Japan's wartime glory was built on a foundation of sacrifice. But the truth is, the greatest cost was never measured in battles or bombs. The downside of victory is often the story that history forgets. It is the price of ambition and the silence that follows. The truth about Japan's wartime actions didn't emerge overnight. It was a slow unraveling of facts, letters, and testimonies that gradually painted a clearer picture of what had happened. Scholars and archivists worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of history from war crimes reports, personal journals, and recovered military records. Through these trials and testimonies, the world began to understand the full scale of Japan's wartime aggression and the suffering it caused. The process of uncovering the truth was not just about facts, it was about reckoning with the past and understanding the human cost of war. This search for truth, though painful, was essential. It allowed the world to remember, to learn, and to prevent such horrors from ever happening again. In the shadow of the war, there was a tiny island that Japan never fully occupied. It's called the Iwo Jima Islands, but it's not what you think. Despite its strategic importance, the Japanese military never fully conquered it. Instead, it was held by American forces, and even after the war, it remained under US control. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Kindle Paperwhite e-reader. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. This unusual situation highlights how even in the midst of total war, there were places where the lines between control and occupation blurred, and where the victors had a say in what came next. It's a small but telling example of how Japan's reach, while vast, was not always absolute, and how the war left behind more than just ruins. What if Japan had chosen to weaponize its isolation and secrecy more ruthlessly, turning its own borders into an impenetrable fortress of control and deception? Imagine a Japan that deliberately kept its military capabilities hidden, using misinformation and propaganda to manipulate global perception of its true strength. This scenario challenges the idea of what a nation can do when it chooses to operate in the shadows, rather than in the light of history. It's a reminder that history is not just about what happened, but also about the possibilities of what could have been, and the choices that define a nation's path. When you think of a modern superpower, you imagine something like the United States. But in 1941, Japan was that kind of power, fast, aggressive, and with the technology to back it up. Japan's navy was more advanced than the US Pacific Fleet in many ways. They had aircraft carriers, submarines, and even radar tools that made them a formidable force in the early days of the war. Japan's war was a gamble. They believed they could win quickly and secure resources before the US could respond, but they miscalculated the scale and resilience of the American war machine. In the end, Japan was not a global superpower, but a regional power that overreached. Its ambitions outstripped its resources, and its strategy was built on a false sense of inevitability. When we compare Japan to the US, we're not just comparing military power. We are looking at how a country's vision, resources, and strategy shape the course of history. Even today, historians argue over whether Japan's defeat was inevitable or if different choices could have changed the outcome. Some say the empire's overreach and poor strategic decisions doomed it, while others believe a different course might have led to a different end. The debate isn't just academic, it's about understanding the past to avoid repeating its mistakes. Without consensus, the lessons of war remain tangled in uncertainty, making it hard to move forward. The past is a mirror, but some say it's cracked, so we can never be sure what it reflects. The key to Japan's success was not just speed, but the precision of its planning. Every move, every attack, was calculated to stretch the enemy's resources and avoid direct confrontation. By choosing targets that were strategically weak, Japan was able to create a perception of overwhelming power, even when it was not fully realized. This deception allowed Japan to control the pace of the war, making the enemy react to its own initiatives rather than its own strategy. It was not just about power, it was about perception, and Japan mastered the art of making the world believe it was stronger than it was. This clever trick made the difference between a war of attrition and one of strategy. It gave Japan an edge no other nation could match. Beginners often assume Japan's war effort was purely about conquest and expansion. But the real story is far more complex than just territorial gains. They fail to grasp that Japan's goals were deeply tied to its own survival and security, not just imperial glory. They overlook the internal divisions and debates within Japan's leadership, which shaped the course of the war in unexpected ways. And they often forget that Japan was not a lone aggressor. Its actions were part of a broader global conflict, not a unique narrative. Understanding Japan's role in WWII requires looking beyond the headlines and into the heart of its people and its history. In the quiet hours of the early morning, A single sheet of paper changed the course of history. A mistake in translation, a misplaced word, a failure to understand the enemy's intent. The Japanese military commanders misread the American signal, thinking it was a routine message rather than a declaration of war. They assumed the US was still in negotiations, not declaring total war. In those few hours, Japan moved to secure its empire, believing they had time to prepare. They didn't realize the war was already underway, and they were playing catch-up from the start. This tiny detail, a single word, a single misunderstanding, created a massive ripple effect. It delayed Japan's response, gave the USA strategic advantage, and set the stage for an entire war. History is made not just by grand decisions, but by the smallest, most human errors. Sometimes it's not what you do, but what you fail to see, that changes everything. In the final year of the war, Japan lost more than 700,000 men in the Pacific. That's more than the entire population of a major city. It's a number that doesn't just tell us how many died, it tells us how much was lost. This number isn't just about soldiers, it's about families, about communities, about the sheer scale of a war that Japan didn't just fight, but believed it had to win. To lose over 700,000 men in a single year is to lose the entire fighting force of a nation in a matter of months. It's a number that reflects not just the cost of war, but the scale of Japan's gamble. It's a number that puts the war in perspective. Japan didn't just lose the war, it lost itself in the process. The cost was not just in lives, but in the very identity of a nation that had wagered everything on a single outcome. That number 700,000 is more than a statistic. It's a reflection of a nation's final, desperate stand and a reminder of what it truly means to fight for survival. In 1942, during the Battle of Midway, Japanese pilots flew their Zeros into a sunlit sky, their white wings catching the light like blades of steel. The moment was captured in photographs that would later become symbols of their bravery and the brutal cost of war. The photos showed the pilots in their flight gear, their faces calm, eyes fixed ahead, their hands gripping the controls with a quiet intensity. It was a moment frozen in time, revealing both their discipline and the weight of the mission ahead. These images were later used in propaganda, showing the world the strength and resolve of the Japanese military. Even as the war turned against them, they became a powerful reminder of the human cost behind the battle. Even today, these moments are remembered not just for their bravery, but for the sacrifice and the tragic consequences of war. They are a testament to the lives lost and the decisions that shaped history. The photo is more than a historical artifact, it is a visual echo of a moment that changed the course of history, and it continues to remind us of the gravity of war and the cost of human choices. Few people ask why Japan didn't try to invade the entire world, but the answer lies in the limits of the resources and the geography of the Pacific. Japan was a small island nation with limited land, and expanding further would have stretched their control too thin. The Japanese military was focused on securing the islands they could control, not on building a global empire. Their strategy was to dominate the Pacific and protect their homeland, not to every continent. But the US was not just far away, it was also incredibly powerful and resource-rich. The Japanese never fully realized how much the Americans could project power across the Pacific, or how quickly they could respond. This lack of awareness about the US military's reach and resilience led to a strategic miscalculation. Japan assumed they could control the Pacific without a massive counterforce, and that assumption proved fatal. The real question is not why Japan attacked, but why they failed to see the full scale of the enemy they were facing. The war was not just about battles, it was about perception, strategy, and the limits of ambition. Japan's war machine was powered by a vision of the future, not just weapons but ideas. They weren't just fighting for territory. They were building a new world order. They studied the West, not just its tanks and planes, but its industrial might and technological imagination. Their factories were designed to produce not just war machines, but the next stage of warfare. Their navy was already planning for the post-war future, aircraft carriers, submarines, and a new kind of warfare that would outpace the world. It wasn't just about winning, it was about leading. In the end, Japan was not just fighting a war, it was trying to shape the next era of global power. The world didn't understand that yet, but the seeds of that vision were already being planted. There are still places in Japan where the echoes of wartime decisions remain unheard, buried beneath layers of silence and official narrative. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40 Oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. Some of the most critical moments of the war, like the true nature of the Japanese surrender, remain locked in the minds of those who lived it, never fully shared. The full extent of Japan's wartime decisions, like the use of biological weapons or the secret operations in the Pacific, still elude even the most dedicated historians. Even today, there are questions that no one can answer definitively, and some that may never be answered, buried in the silence of history. The mystery of Japan's role in World War II is not just about what was done, it's about what was left unsaid, and why. Japan's naval power was unmatched in the early years of the war, with carriers like the Akagi and Yamato dominating the Pacific. These ships were symbols of Japan's ambition and technological reach. The Japanese military believed in the power of speed and surprise. This mindset led to bold strategies, like the attack on Pearl Harbor, which caught the United States off guard. Japan's code-breaking efforts were initially successful, giving them an edge in communication and strategy. But they were eventually outpaced by Allied intelligence. The Japanese army was highly disciplined, but it also faced internal conflicts and political infighting, which sometimes hampered its effectiveness in the field. Despite their early success, Japan's resource limitations and vast war zones eventually turned the tide. The empire was too large to sustain, and its people were stretched thin. Japan's legacy in World War II is complex, a mix of brilliance, ambition, and tragic miscalculation. Their story remains a powerful lesson in the cost of hubris and the weight of history. Let me recap what led Japan to dominate the early years of World War II. A mix of imperial ambition, military dominance, and belief in their own superiority set them on a path of expansion. Their conquests in China, the Pacific, and Southeast Asia were rapid and brutal, fueled by a belief in the divine mission of the emperor and a desire to secure resources. Despite initial successes, Japan's expansion stretched their resources thin, leading to overextension and a critical loss of strategic initiative. Ultimately, Japan's rule in World War II was a product of miscalculation, hubris, and a failure to adapt to a changing global order. In the final months of the war, Japan faced a choice: surrender or fight to the last man. They chose the latter, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep, almost religious belief in the invincibility of their cause. This was not just a military decision, it was a cultural and spiritual one. Japan's leaders saw their country as a sacred entity, and to surrender was to admit defeat in the face of the divine. The kamikaze pilots, who flew suicide missions, were not merely soldiers, they were seen as warriors offering their lives for the survival of the nation in a final act of devotion. Japan's leaders believed that their nation's fate was sealed by the gods, and that to surrender was to betray the will of the heavens. This belief, while tragic, shaped the final days of the war in ways that history will never forget. In the end, the choice was not just about military power, it was about identity, faith, and the weight of a civilization's legacy. And that, perhaps, is why Japan ruled the war in the minds of its people. As we close this chapter, I hope you found clarity in the past and insight into the present. History isn't just about battles, it's about the choices we make, the lessons we carry, and the futures we shape. The story of Japan in World War II is complex, layered with ambition, pride, and profound consequences. It's a reminder that power, without wisdom, can lead to ruin. Thank you for watching. I hope this journey through history has left you with more than knowledge, it has left you with thought. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep seeking the truth beneath the surface of history. Goodbye, and take care. The world, it is vast, and so is our shared history. Let's keep exploring it, one beat at a time. Before you go, if you enjoyed this, please give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell us in the comments what you'd like us to make next. We read every single one. Thank you so much for watching. Comment this emoji if you made it to the end.